Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to another Supatease video. And there was a recent esports competition in China where NetEase organized an event where players would attack training dummies and showcase what is truly possible from every specialization in World of Warcraft. And Blizzard has given their commentary on the most recent event, which I think is going to be illuminating towards the future of class design and class balance and what you could likely expect from your specialization of choice moving into the future. So I wanted to cover it here in today's video. And as always, if you want to make sure that you're staying in the loop with World of Warcraft, smash that subscribe button. Your support is greatly appreciated. So Morgan Day, one of the highest ups here at Blizzard Entertainment, is going to talk to us about the DPS rankings of this current competition and event. This event was organized as a competition to show off the skills of the players and kind of highlight possibly some of the advantages and disadvantages of those classes independently of each other, and to give Blizzard feedback, which they actually responded to based off of this event. So the Q&A down here, which is the most important part of this entire thing, although the competition took place closer to the start of patch 11.1, the assistant game director Morgan Day was invited to watch back over the footage, offering commentary and insight while answering a few community questions. Do note that this was before 11.1.5, so some comments made here may no longer be relevant or may have already been addressed, but I do think that they acknowledge where they want the classes to move into the future, which is a really big thing. You know, like if you're expecting your class to see some dramatic, flux from where it currently is or not. So for Death Knights, he says that they are always fun to have, especially in Mythic Plus, where Death Grip has a lot of potential to save the day. Historically, Frost has always been a very proc-dependent class, and with a more reactive playstyle that they think is interesting. But they want to make sure Unholy doesn't start to feel too similar. So they're aware of the clear identity of these two specs, right? One is kind of a ramping dot-based specialization that summons minions, whereas the other one is kind of a whack-a-mole proc and pop type of play style, which they have held, decently strong so far. Obviously, Unholy has the proc death coils, which could be pretty similar or akin to Frost. But for the most part, I would say they are identifiably different. But what does that mean for Frost? He doesn't really speak to, cooldowns, how our class is too cooldown dependent. In the past they talked about Unholy DK having their cooldowns be desynced, and they wanted to sync those cooldowns up. He doesn't really go into too much detail here as far as Frost Death Knight and if they're happy with them being like the Pillar of Frost big moments or trying to allocate that damage into other resources. So it kind of just seems like Death Knight is probably going to be staying pretty much the same moving into the future. For Demon Hunters, they are another very popular class with unique mobility that feels like an action combat class. They know that Vengeance is very strong right now, and they've gotten a lot of feedback regarding the viability of tank options. I think Vengeance is still technically the number one tank right now, even though they talked about this being in a previous patch. But this sounds like they like Demon Hunter where it is, and it's probably not going to see a huge amount of changes. And I mean, likely not any buffs if they believe that it's strong at the current moment in time. So Demon Hunters, if you like the class right now, not too much is going to be changing for you. Balanced Druids have such a good ranged or split cleave, which makes it really popular for the Race to World First, to the point that they actually had to make some Mythic and Raid difficulty adjustments because of it. I can remember that back in Legion when I was actually raiding in Tomb of Sargeras. There's lots of bosses, like I can't remember what her name was. She's one of the female Naga bosses that would summon in fish from all the waters, and you're just doing massive AoE damage with Starfall. I always wish that this could be captured in PvP, but it just never actually comes completely to fruition. It might have popped up every once in a while for a few weeks, and if it does, it usually gets nerfed out of the game. This is making me think that they're probably not going to be doing that to it. But Boomkin might get a nerf. This is leaning to some tendencies that they're aware of that, and maybe they're going to rein the power in. They want to ensure that Balanced Druid AoE feels a major strength, but it can sometimes cause tuning problems at the very high end if they feel too required. Interesting statement, they're too required. I mean, anything that does the top damage is too required, right? Like when it comes to tuning, every group just invites, they do the highest damage, they invite them, at least in PvE. Unless you have a completely unique mechanic, right? Like a raid cooldown right now. It used to be raid buff. Now it's like raid cooldown is the reason that you get taken. And also raid buff still to some extent, right? With Mark of the Wild and Arcane Intellect and things like that. But this is making me think that they got some eyes on Boomkin. For Feral Druid, changes can sometimes be ambiguous when they buff one thing but nerf another, making it hard to tell what the actual gameplay goal is. There are a number of people on the classic and retail development teams who have a passion for Feral, who are always interested in ways to improve the specializations. So they'll take that feedback into consideration and try to make sure that the intent of their changes are clear. I think they're talking about bleed versus bite builds. And they often will just fluctuate on a pendulum, buffing the bleed talents while nerfing the bite talents, or buffing the bite talents and nerfing the bleed talents, right? And there are clear distinctions in play. One is focused around AoE sustain damage. The other one is focused on single target, or maybe even burst damage to some extent. But it seems like this statement is kind of just pretty generic, and they're just going to keep doing what they're doing, and they're trying to do a better job of helping players understand why they're nerfing bite or bleed builds, depending on which side of the pendulum they're swung onto on any given balance stroke. For Evokers, you got a massive paragraph. They have gone through quite a journey in Season 2. Strong out of the gate and well represented in the race to world first, against because AUG was just mandatory, right? Like, no one was playing Dev, I assume, at least in PvE. They bring a lot of awesome utility and impressive burst AoE, so it's not surprising to see them doing very well. Is he talking about Dev Evoker? Or maybe Dev Evoker actually is at the top right now, actually, in Raid, I think. Last time that I looked at it. It's not historically been that high, but I guess since they completely obliterated AUG, maybe they let it kind of have a chance to shine for once. One, if not the strongest DPS specs in the Raid, also with a ton of utility. It does have that mid-range weakness, but it's made up for with quite a number of strengths. Hero talent representation is something the team is keeping an eye on to make sure players can pick and choose between the playstyle they prefer. So they'll continue to keep an eye out for that, as well as to make sure Devastation doesn't get too far ahead. Regarding augmentation, they got a lot of changes going into Season 2, and there's room to buff them, which has happened repeatedly. Though given how strong they were for so long, the team is okay being a little conservative at the moment. Okay, so this is nice for like identifying trends. If you're a class that's been good for too long, they're okay with you being kind of bad for a little bit. So if you're in that spot, like you're a spot like, oh my god, you're just riding the biggest high for so long, they might bring you down. But I think that's going to be maybe more oriented towards PvE. But we did see that in PvP with Fury Warriors, right? Fury Warrior has been dominating as the main warrior spec in PvP. It's gone now. It's all arms warriors. So that likely that line of thinking is also going to apply even in PvP situations. But they're aware of this, right? So Dev might see some nerfs. They'll likely keep PvP-specific changes to it as well if it ends up being too much of a nerf on the PvP side of things. But that's an interesting point of insight. That's why I think going into these articles and reading through the exact thoughts of the developers and designers to see how they go about changes and how you can apply that to the changes in the future is really a worthwhile thing to do. For Marksmanship Hunter, they got quite a large rework in the Undermine update, and anytime that happens, it took the big risk with no pet. And anytime that happens, they always know that they're going to need a little bit of aftercare, and with follow-up tuning passes since the race to world first, both Marks and Survival seem to be doing very well in the raid, so hopefully the community is happier now than they were at the start of the season. I flash back to the Ian Hazakosis interview showing that the balance is closer than it was, and people still get mad about the balance. It's just one of those things where you're either bringing a class because it does the highest damage, or you're bringing the class because it brings a buff that makes everyone else do higher damage than if the class wasn't there. And those are the only two reasons really to ever bring a class. Or it's a mandatory raid save cooldown or something like that. It's the three main reasons. And if you don't fall into those ones, because one of those categories, you're not going to fit in the best in slot group, unfortunately. But so he doesn't talk about Beast Mastery at all, which is interesting. But it seems like Hunter's probably not. They seem to be pretty happy with the adjustments they've made to the Hunter with all the reworks. It's probably not going to change too much. And Marks and PvP I've been having a lot of fun with. Seems a bit overtuned. Again, on aim shot, I'd like to see aim shot damage go into some other abilities because it's just getting like absolutely one-tapped. It can be kind of annoying, at least in PvP situations. But for the most part, PvP tuning is really good at the moment. Frost Mage. Proc management can feel a little overwhelming, especially when it's not obvious which proc you should be prioritizing at any given time. Newer players may get a lot out of the upcoming combat assistant features in that regard. Mage has also had a lot of its viability dictated by set bonuses, and they try to be really careful to recognize whether a spec is overpowered or if its tier set bonus might just happen to be out of line. That's really important, right? Like, think about Resto Druid in PvP this season before its 4Ps. Everyone thought it was the worst spec in the game and needed the most amount of buffs. And then when it got its 4 set, it was God mode, Giga class. Everyone's like, oh my god, I can't believe Resto Druid is this strong. So they kind of don't follow the line of thinking, though, because that set bonus is actually so strong that it's compensating for the class. Like, when we lose that set bonus, Resto Druid's going to feel a lot worse. So they've said that they're going to try and recognize that and be aware of it, is it going to actually happen? I think this is where we can maybe try and hold a little bit of accountability, because there are definitely some specs. Even like Affliction Warlock getting UA on multiple targets is a really powerful effect in PvP that I've been enjoying at the moment. And when that's gone in the next patch, I'm going to kind of wish that becomes a talent or baked into the class baseline or something, which honestly I think is something they should do and consider. The set bonuses should be an opportunity to experiment, and if it works out, it's a really cool mechanic, it should just be baseline. And if a set bonus is not, it can go into retirement, and it can be a way to experiment to advance the class in real time, basically, is how I would like it to be from my own experience. But they've shown that they want to recognize that, but it's kind of an issue. It's going to be an issue, especially if the set bonus next season isn't that good, and Warlock sometimes ends up not getting the best set bonuses. Windwalker Monk. Single target damage was also really strong during the Race to World First, though some adjustments have since come down. Really nothing about Monk. Nothing about like the kit, how it feels, the hit combo, the viability aspect, really just not a lot. So I would imagine not a lot's going on with it, right? Like some of these have a lot more bias than others. Paladin is one of the most popular classes. See, this is why I'm wondering why might be why they make Ret Paladin super OP. Because they want to retain players, right? And if Ret's at the bottom and their most amount of players play Ret, then they're going to quit if their spec sucks. So I think they're actually in a bind where they have to make Ret the most ridiculous class in the game to retain those players right now, if that's the case. So this, again, really good interview to get this type of insight to see what's going on. Though there's been a lot of criticism with how simple Retribution is, something the team talks a lot about is skill expression and how high the skill ceiling should be. Well, think about Ret. They've added like auto sack, auto. I think there's a lot of other talents as well that I haven't even really looked at. They tried auto bubble with Ret at some points in time as well. So it's definitely been made a lot more simple, particularly for classes without multiple DPS specs. If Ret or Shadow Priest is hard to play or has a really high skill ceiling, there's not really anywhere for a player who loves the class but doesn't necessarily have the ability to keep up with its rotation. So they tend to be a little more forgiving by design. Is that even true? I feel like Shadow Priest is crazy difficult to play. What's another one? Like Shadow Priest Ellie, maybe? Ellie is pretty difficult to play. Maybe it's Ellie's probably a bit easier, but Shadow is really hard to play. I get this logic. I think that makes sense. Like with Hunter, you can have an easier spec, a harder spec, and have different levels of difficulty. That's like one of the best nuances of the simplicity and difficulty and complexity of design that they choose for the classes. Some can be more complex, some simpler, right? Rogue, Assassination is a bit easier. Outlaws, Omega hard. Salty maybe is somewhere in the middle, or also Omega hard. So you can kind of flex on the class, and even within hero talent trees themselves for enhance. Stormbringer is much simpler. Totemic is really complicated, a lot more binds. So having the option to flex between those is nice. But do they have like a ceiling on how complex can it really be, or how simple can a spec be? So in terms of Retribution Paladin, the DPS rotation is a lot easier to execute, but Paladins have a huge ceiling in their utility, like a Clutch Lay on Hands or Blessing of Freedom. They've even automated this, so you just freedom yourself. Freedom's an ally. Having an easier DPS rotation allows more bandwidth to look for those opportunities. So that's where they feel like a lot of Retribution skill expression comes from. But Priest has Massive Spell to pay attention to, Life Grip to pay attention to, Void Shift, which I think is in PvE now too, isn't it? Like Shadow Priest has even more intense stuff that is cast times to pay attention to. It's really hard to play relative to Paladin. And I've seen PvE rotation guides for Shadow. So there's a bit of an inconsistency here. I feel like I respect the approach that he's got here. I think that the logic is sound and makes sense, but there's some inconsistency with other hybrids that are in this type of position, right, where they only have one DPS option for them. Shadow Priest, let's see what he has to say about it, because he just was talking about it. They don't mention Disc or Holy at all here. Really big. Oh, well, obviously I think it's mostly because this is a DPS contest, right? Shadow Priest has a conflict between its damage, survival, and utility talents. And although having a choice between them can sometimes be valuable, the team has tried to make it easier to take really critical talents without feeling like you're giving up performance to do so. That's because the core talent tree that they've come with Dragonflight does have flaws like the original vanilla trees, where it's like these are baseline talents you have to take every time, and they're really only flexing like 4 or 5. Like that was actually a true statement. But the value of the talent tree is when you level up, you get to put a point in something, which feels cool. So there's a bit of a conflict there. And then them organizing the tree in a way so that you can make those choices without losing baseline stuff is what they need to be doing, which is what they've said that they're going to be looking at, which is good. The team is always looking to make sure that each spec has viable options and playstyle choices, though Priests are, again, a class with only one DPS spec, so they want to make sure that it's a little more forgiving. I haven't really experimented too much with the talents of Shadow Priest to say whether or not like how much you're losing as far as being able to get to utility versus damage. But if you're a Shadow Priest and this is something that is actually the case, then you can likely look forward to that as an improvement in the future. For rogues, they have so much unique playstyle and fantasy between its specializations, and they like that the three feel pretty unique. I would agree. You know, one is a bleed class, it focuses on tagging multiple targets. Outlaw's kind of just a cleave brawler, and Subtlety is like this burst, fast, quick-paced spec. I would agree with that. Outlaw could probably do better, especially when talking about target caps. They talk a lot about strengths and weaknesses, and with a class that has 3 DPS specs, it can be a challenge to make sure it's clear what each of them are supposed to do. Patch 11.1.5 included a number of hot fixes, the fixing of Blade Flurry from trying to hit dead targets, which should help lead to more consistent performance. That is ridiculous. Blade Flurry was hitting dead targets? Is it talking about actual dead targets or like fluff mobs that you don't care about instead of the mobs that you do, right? Like sometimes you got 3 mobs that spawn extra minions that don't matter, and hitting extra minions doesn't matter. Is that what they're talking about by a dead mob? Or are they talking about it literally trying to do damage to corpses that it couldn't do damage? Because that's an insane bug. That's an insane bug to read. Elemental Shaman is fun to discuss, bringing a lot of tools and utility, especially for different affixes, purge, dispels, not to mention a huge amount of raw AoE damage against unmoving targets. Single target is a lot lower, but when discussing strengths and weaknesses, developers try to ensure they're challenging players with enough interesting content options so that those strengths and weaknesses feel relevant. I think it's talking about like dungeon balance, right? Like how much percentage of a dungeon is AoE versus single target, so that you'll feel good for 30% of the dungeon, but maybe 30% your class feels a little bit weaker, but you've got a moment at least in the content where you feel strong. Where was I? Developers try to ensure they're challenging players and that those strengths and weaknesses feel relevant. It's not fun to have a strength that's barely ever relevant. In a single target versus AoE, it's a big part of that conversation. So they're likely going to be continuing to look at dungeon raid balance and making sure that there's a number of encounters that are equally proportional so that they can make sure that you feel strong as an AoE class and you're still going to be able to get into the group, which sounds good. For Warlocks, need some reworking on the left side of their class talent tree. This is a big one. It's a constant evaluation of what the talent trees are bringing and where they need more unique options in those spaces. There's still a handful of classes that don't bring a traditional raid buff, but they feel that DK and Warlock specifically have such interesting utility in Death Grip and Gateways and Hellstones, and that they still bring a lot of value. Yes, so a raid cooldown or major utility or a raid buff. As long as you have one of those things, you're probably going to get at least one spot in the raid as long as the encounter actually requires that you have it. Traditional raid buffs like Battle Shout are really easy way to make a class feel required, though Morgan wishes that they could have cool and unique fantasy options for every class. In terms of damage, the team is constantly making balance adjustments. The minus 5% to Demonology, or the 5% buff, to Demonology was on the high end of those adjustments because they want to throw the overall balance out of whack with a spec that was on the bottom suddenly jumping to number 1 instead. 5% had enough to do that? They try to be a little conservative because they know they can always make another adjustment later. Oh no, they're saying they don't want to skyrocket a spec to the top. But that's happened every now and then, right? Like Holy Priest went from bottom of the barrel healer and then all the way to the top. And then sometimes you're too conservative and you can't even see a change, right? Like the tuning adjustments is such a finite, it requires so much detail and effort to hit so that you can get it actually correct with as few changes as possible, ideally, so that players aren't sitting around a week where either they became super OP and everyone hates everything, or they didn't see any change at all, right? I swear it's an art to be able to tune it. I make it the same as music. You can sing a note, a pitch, like la, and it can be flat or sharp, which means it's too far below the pitch or too far above the pitch, and you need to adjust it to play it in tune. And the longer you take to adjust it to get it into tune, the longer you sound bad, and no one wants to listen to you sing. It's the same thing with the class tuning that's coming in here, but this is more insight, right? That they do try to aim to this, but I will say again, I think every now and then that doesn't end up being the case, right? Like they were pretty okay with Sledgehammer nerfing Og, so there are circumstances where they will be willing to do that, but it seems like it have to be extreme cases. Warrior representation tends to be based on which spec is doing better in Mythic Plus at the moment. They believe the class does bring decent amounts of tools, but the meta tends to focus more on casters, leading to debates on what kind of cool utility they could give to a warrior. You might get new stuff. Battle resing would be kind of hilarious, but it's something the team has been thinking about looking forward to for Season 3. Tier sets have also had an interesting impact on tuning, as sometimes an abnormally strong or weak tier set upsets balance, despite the core class being fine. So he's talking again, relaying to that. But battle res might be the thing they're thinking about giving warrior. Now PvP, that doesn't do anything for us, right? But they do want to try and give you something crazy new for warrior, and they're really aware of the set bonus stuff. So hopefully this means that if Affliction Warlock, for example, has a weak set bonus next patch, or Rest of Druid, they'll be receptive to that feedback, because there are specs right now where the set bonus is absolutely carrying the spec, and it's going to need to be compensated for, whether the next set bonus can do that by itself or through the baseline class changes. But a lot of insight on this update, so I just wanted to talk about it with you, give some of my thoughts about it. Some classes seems like you didn't have a lot to talk about, a lot to say. Other ones had huge updates that could be something to keep an eye on for the future. So thank you guys for hanging out with me in today's video, and I will see you in the next one.